first down. They hand off to Marlon Mack. Huge hole, 50-yard line. He's at the 40, still going near sideline. He's at the 10. He's at the 5, and he will score. Touchdown, Marlon Mack. Touchdown, INDY. And again, it's picked up. It's Darius Leonard. Leonard with his second INT, and he's streaking down the near sideline. He's at the 40. He's at the 30. He's at the 20. He's going to go. A pick six for the Maniac.
Horseshoe is back, baby. The horseshoe is back.
Hey, what is going on, Colts Nation? Welcome back to another episode of the Bring the Juice Colts podcast. Football is so close. Can't believe it's officially game week. The Colts kick off in Jacksonville this next Sunday, 1 p.m. And I wanted to bring on a friend of the show from StampedeBlue.com to discuss some other things with roster cutdowns and all that stuff. Mr. Zach Hicks from StampedeBlue.com. Zach, thank you for coming on the show, my friend. So let's talk about this real fast. Let's start talking about this. The Indianapolis Colts, they recently made a waiver claim. They claimed tight end Noah Togiai off of waivers. Now, Togiai was originally went undrafted this year, was signed by the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles wanted to bring him back on their practice squad. They cut him at the initial 53-man cut down. The Colts go and they poach him off of that. So, overall, Zach, I'm curious. What are your thoughts on Noah Togiai and potentially what he can bring as the number 3 tight end until Trey Burton returns from his injury he sustained in training camp?
Yeah, so I wasn't super familiar with him throughout the draft process. I didn't really scout too much of him. I mean, he was an undrafted free agent out of Oregon State. And yeah, on film, he looked like a solid player. I mean, I wouldn't say he was an elite athlete or anything like that, but he looked like a good athlete, above average athlete. There's a really nice video of him hurdling a guy, I think, against UCLA last year. And I watched a little bit on all 22, but I think I had just the one game against I think my game I have was against UCLA. I think his hurdle was against someone else, but the one game I have was against UCLA, and he didn't really do much in the receiving department. But he looks like a solid player. I don't think he looks like anything, super special, but he did have a good camp with the Eagles. I know the Eagles really wanted to have him back. That was their kind of plan, was to waive him, and then they were going to re-sign him the next day. So they definitely wanted him back. And, if the Eagles wanted him, then I'm sure Frank Reich wanted him too. So I think it all kind of just worked out for the Colts to get a decent player in here who had a whole offseason working with the Eagles, who, that's kind of similar to the Colts scheme. So I think, I'm not going to say he's going to beat out any of these other tight ends when Burton comes back or anything like that. But I think he's a good fill-in guy until Burton comes back, and then he can just jump on that practice squad.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Zach. I think that he's a solid player, a solid number 3 option for the Colts until Burton does come back. Let's look at this final 53-man roster. I haven't gotten your take on it yet, Zach. So the Colts made their initial 53-man cut down. I'm curious for you, were there any potential cuts or potential guys that stayed on the roster that you were really surprised about? And maybe that be, you think about it, maybe it's a guy you felt like, oh man, I did not expect him to stay on the roster, did not expect them to keep this many guys at this position, or I felt like they should have kept more guys at this position, because I had some thoughts on it as well. So for our listeners, be sure to check back at my initial kind of live stream reaction, along with Andrew Thomason and Jim Aiello on the Colts 53-man trim down. But Zach, for you, were there any positions or guys that you were surprised made the final 53-man?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest things that they kept that really threw me off was, Chaz Green at the 8th offensive lineman, or the, 3rd string tackle, essentially. Even though there was kind of some hints to that throughout the offseason, Chris Ballard, I believe, or Frank Reich, I think, said it, that, it was Chaz Green and LaRaven Clark competing for that backup tackle spot. And that should have been a little bit of a giveaway that they were higher on Chaz Green than a lot of us are. I mean, if you guys don't know who Chaz Green is, he is the guy who gave up 6 sacks in one game to Adrian Claiborne. I think it's not even passable if you give up that many sacks in one game to a guy like Aaron Donald, but giving up to someone like Adrian Claiborne, who's more of a rotational, decent player in this league, I think that's a big red flag. But who knows? Maybe he got a lot better since then. Hopefully he got a lot better since then. I don't know how he'd be on an NFL roster if he didn't. But yeah, I think that was a big concern and a big I guess I wouldn't say concern. I mean, again, I wasn't at any of the practices. I don't know how well he looked, but I think that was the biggest surprise was Chaz Green actually making this roster. And besides that, I would say maybe the 7 linebackers. I could have swore they were going to cut at least one of those guys. But, all of them are really talented players. They should all be on NFL rosters. I mean, I would probably say I don't want to say worst because, again, I think they're all good players, but the most likely one who should have been cut was probably Matthew Adams. But I think Matthew Adams can be, a backup or even a low-end starting Sam in this league. So I understand why they kept 7 in terms of, all these guys are good enough to be on an NFL roster, but it's definitely shocking to see the Colts keep that many at linebacker with how little they play. They don't even play 3 linebackers that much. I mean, the base defense in the NFL now is nickel. So you're usually just playing 2 linebackers on the field. So keeping 7 guys at a position where you mostly play just 2 on the field at one time, I thought that was a little bit surprising. But again, all these guys are good players. They all deserve to be on rosters. And if the Colts felt like, they want to just keep the best players and, and all of them are good special teamers as well. So yeah, I don't mind that decision at all. I just thought it was a bit shocking.
Yeah, definitely there was some surprise moves for me as well. Zach, are there any other guys potentially around the league, some guys that got released potentially, or guys that are on practice squads right now that you feel like the Colts should potentially look at acquiring? Because we've talked about it on this podcast. We feel like this is a very deep team overall from 1 to 53, but there are still a few positions that we feel like we could potentially add to. Are there any guys or any position groups in particular that stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking around the league right now, the Colts still have 2 empty spots on their roster or on their practice squad that they could add. They might throw Trey Burton on IR here in the next couple of days. We don't know if he'll be ready by week 3. So that's something to watch. They might even have an extra roster spot coming up. But yeah, I really thought they could have done more at outside corner, like adding somebody there. I thought a waiver claim or, even a free agent signing this late in the game. I thought that would make sense because after Marvell Tell opted out, they really needed another outside corner. They don't really have any outside corner depth behind Rock and Xavier Rhodes. I mean, those are really the only 2 outside corners on the roster right now. So I really am shocked that they didn't, go after a guy like Sidney Jones is out there still. I think he's on the practice squad for the Jaguars right now. Corner that they got traded to the Patriots throughout this offseason. And the Patriots ended up cutting him as Michael Jackson, the former Miami corner, Miami College. And I thought he would have been a really good fit for what the Colts want to do. But even on the free agent market, like a guy like Prince Amukamara is out there. I really would like the Colts to go after a guy like that even. So I'm just mostly – I really want to see them do something at that, because I've been looking at some TJ Carey film today just to kind of get ready for him to be the backup boundary corner this year. And I just don't see it at outside corner. I really don't see it outside corner. I think he can be a fine slot corner, fine slot depth, in terms of his tackling and he plays a little bit better as kind of a third, as a linebacker type in that kind of short area. But as an outside corner, I just don't see it. I think there's just too many flaws in his game to play outside corner. So it really does concern me what's going to happen if one of those, if Rock Ya-Sin or Xavier Rhodes goes down. But we'll have to kind of see and keep monitoring that. I'm sure Ballard understands that there's something they have to do there, especially if one of those guys goes down. But I think that was an area where they could have added someone else. The tight end move caught me a little bit of surprise because Hale Henches and Ross Travis were both out there. But again, if their scouting staff really believes in this guy, I'm sure that he'll be a fine fit. And I think they're still going to be looking at offensive line depth as well. I liked a couple guys from the draft that were on the waivers. I think Prince Tega Wanaghu was out there, and he's on the Eagles practice squad right now. I would have been interested in at least taking a flyer on him, even though I know he's had a lot of injury issues and kind of had an up and down camp with the Eagles. I would have been a little interested in bringing him over here as that eighth offensive lineman instead of Chaz Green. But again, I'm sure they're going to be monitoring that position and upgrading and switching that out throughout the season as well. But, there were a couple younger guys I would have liked them to grab and scoop up, but they do have 2 more spots left on the practice squad. I'm sure that they're looking at Marcus Johnson a little closely for that. But we'll see who they add with those last 2 spots.
Definitely. Well, let's look at this practice squad. Let me pull up the names here for the Colts practice squad names that we can talk about, potentially some guys that we think could potentially, maybe contribute to this roster. The Colts right now have 14 guys on their practice squad. I'll just read them off here. Andre Chakiri, I can never pronounce his last name right. Defensive tackle Cameron Klein, guard Jake Eldrenkamp, wide receiver Doris Fountain, tight end Farid Green, defensive end Gary Green, tight end Xavier Grimble, wide receiver DeMichael Harris, center Joey Hunt, quarterback Chad Kelly, offensive tackle Carter O'Donnell, cornerback Tremont Smith, defensive tackle Chris Williams, and defensive tackle Rob Windsor. So of these 14 guys, Zach, who are some that you think potentially could contribute to this roster? Obviously, probably not week one, but maybe as the season progresses, maybe even into next year and in the future, who are some guys that you think really could contribute to this roster right away and potentially, if they're in a pinch and they need a guy to come in, they could actually play pretty well?
Yeah, I mean, first guy we got to mention is Robert Windsor. Obviously, he's the type that, the Colts would have liked to keep him on the roster. They really do like him, and he had a really strong camp for the Colts, but it kind of came down to numbers. With Tyquan Lewis having the camp he did, the Colts felt like they had enough at that 3-tech position, at least going into the season, and they just really needed more 1-tech depth, and that's where Taylor Stallworth made the roster over Robert Windsor. Like, I don't think the Colts would even say that if you compare them as players, Taylor Stallworth's a better player than Robert Windsor or even has more potential. I just think it came down to where they really need depth on the roster, and that's why Windsor got cut instead of Stallworth. But I think Windsor is a guy who they have long-term, maybe not like super long-term, but, they have future plans with, and they want him on this roster. And I think we'll see him on this roster sooner rather than later. If there's injuries or another guy goes on IR, I believe he'll be the first guy called up. Cam Klein, the other defensive tackle on the practice squad, I know the Colts have a plan for him. They really see long-term potential with him to at least be a rosterable player. So he's definitely got to keep an eye on. And, obviously just a fan favorite, Darius Fountain, just a great story with him coming back from the injury last year after he had a great camp last season. He actually came back this year and had a pretty good camp as well. It really just came down to special teams, him not making the roster this year. Ashton Doolin beat him out for that last receiver spot. And Doolin's an excellent gunner. He even has some potential as a receiver as well. So I understand that decision for them to go with Doolin over Fountain. But luckily, Fountain got back to the practice squad. Mm-hmm. And again, with injuries that we see at receiver, especially with this team, we'll probably see him up on the roster sooner rather than later as well. So those three guys definitely excite me the most. And then also Carter O'Donnell. I think there's some potential there for him to be that eighth lineman. I think he can play some guard, play some tackle. So maybe we'll see, him swapped out for Chaz Green if Carter O'Donnell has some good practice here at the practice squad. But those are the four guys that probably excite me the most on the practice squad. The other guys could probably be called up any other time too and get some playing time because we have all these rules in place now where we can get guys up. But, those four guys are probably the ones that excite me the most.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Robert Windsor, let's start with him. So, from all accounts, Robert Windsor had a great camp, but you mentioned it. It's just that you need more depth at the 1-tech position. Because I was thinking, if Sheldon Day misses significant time, who are you going to have behind him? That was a big question mark. We thought Sheldon Day was going to be that backup 1-tech to Grover Stewart and just adding some more depth. Now, I know Robert Windsor played a little bit of 1-tech when he was at Penn State, but then he switched over to 3-tech by the end of it, so he would probably play more of that. But I think when Sheldon Day gets healthy, maybe we could see Robert Windsor make the roster as opposed to Taylor Stallworth, who you mentioned. So definitely agree there. And I'm glad you didn't include Chad Kelly on your list. I'm so glad you didn't include Chad Kelly. I mean, man, we've had people just hyping him up. I mean, for whatever reason, man, Colts Nation is just like, not all of them, but there's just this little chunk of them that are just so high on Chad Kelly. I mean, a lot of people think he's going to be the next great quarterback. So I appreciate you not including him on your list. I really, really do.
The thing with Kelly is it's always like this with fans. And I'm not trying to call out anybody who listens to this show. I'm sure it's not everyone. And I'm sure even people who have reasons for him, reasons for liking him, it can go back to his college days even because he was a good college quarterback. The biggest thing I think that people misconstrue a little bit when it comes to quarterback plays, preseason doesn't always leak over to actual regular season success. And I know he had a pretty good preseason, even though he threw like a 2 or 3 picks too in that preseason. I think he threw at least one. That was a really bad pass. So it wasn't even like he had like a phenomenal preseason last year that would lead to all this hype. But, when you get a guy who's got this this kind of outspoken personality, some people like that. And then you have, really good college stats. You had a good preseason. People get excited. But I will tell you, I covered Washington football team. And, they weren't a football team back then. But I covered them for a couple of years. And every single preseason, Colt McCoy would just tear up other teams. I mean, Colt McCoy was outstanding in the preseason, just a very, very good preseason quarterback. And people were clamoring for him to start over Kirk Cousins and RG3 when RG3 started going down. And Colt McCoy was not it. And I want to tell you guys that, sometimes the preseason star is not really it. There's a reason why they're not really getting, real opportunities. Chad Kelly, if he really was as good as a lot of these people are clamoring for, he'd be claimed by another team and he'd be, out there on Sundays. But, it's a fun story. I'm sure people like it. I don't even think he's a bad practice squad quarterback. He's obviously a talented player. It's just, people get carried away with the preseason star and they kind of run with it. But, I don't blame them. It's kind of what we see. It's all we really get to see out of the offseason. I mean, especially in off season like this year, we don't get to see anything. So you kind of have to think back to last year. But yeah, personally, I'm kind of done with the Chad Kelly hype too. I know a lot of people keep saying he's a star and the best quarterback on the roster and stuff. And it's just it's a little too much. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't even in a competition to be the third string quarterback. I mean, he was either practice squad quarterback this year or not on the roster. So, or not even with the team. So yeah, it goes a little too far.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you there, Zach. It's absolutely crazy. Like, we have this guy named Justin who will come onto our live streams. Now, he's obviously trolling us, but he'll come onto our live streams and he'll say, Chad Kelly's the GOAT. He knows Derek and I are kind of over it at this point. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if he was that great of a quarterback, he'd be on the active roster. And if not with the Colts, he'd be on the active roster on another team. I mean, he goes unclaimed. So, that kind of speaks to what other teams view him and how the Colts view him. So let's talk about another guy in the practice squad that you mentioned, Reese Fountain. So Reese Fountain obviously had a horrific injury last year in a preseason game. Horrific injury in practice. And it was just awful. And it's so great to see that he has fully recovered, had a really good camp by all indications. But, the number 6 wide receiver position, you're going to probably have to play special teams. Reese Fountain really doesn't play a ton of special teams. And so I guess I'm curious for you, Zach, your thoughts on, first off, the 6th wide receiver, Ashton Doolin, playing special teams. And then also just how big is it for a guy like Desmond Patman, who came in as a rookie 6th-round pick this year, to make the active 53-man roster? What does that speak about him?
Yeah, so the biggest thing with Patman coming into camp, each of these guys had things that made them stand out. Doolin, it was his special teams ability. Marcus Johnson, it was his experience in the NFL and how well he played late last season. Reese Fountain, it was his training camp last year and also, being a recent draft pick. Desmond Patton, his biggest thing that he had going for him, that he really had a leg up in this competition, was just his height, weight, speed, like size, everything, all the intangibles that you could look for in a receiver. He's a huge guy. I think he's like 6'4", like 230. Like, he's huge. Yeah. Just an absolute monster. He could even be like a move tight end if you wanted him to be. He's a really big guy. And I think that really helped him, because the Colts really like those athletes at receiver. And I think they just need to see some good camps out of him, some good, performances and a good camp out of him to be enough to make this roster. And from everything that we heard, he was almost easily the 5th best receiver on the team, if not even better than, guys like Pascal in practice and stuff like that. Even though we know Zach Pascal's going to be ahead of him on the depth chart, he might have had some good practices that were better than Pascal at times. So, by everything we heard, he was one of the better receivers in camp. He started with the 3rd team, moved up to 2nd team, got some reps with the 1st team even. So I think even then, that's kind of when we could have assumed that he was going to make the roster. When you're looking at that 5th, 6th receiver, you either have to be great at special teams or you have to have an outstanding camp. And unfortunately, Fountain got outplayed by Patman in terms of being a receiver in camp. And then obviously Doolin had the better special teams and was, a really, really good gunner for the team last year. So yeah, it just came down to numbers for Reese Fountain. But again, I'm happy he got back on the practice squad and I'm sure he'll be up soon. But I think it's a good testament to how good Patman was this whole offseason, because obviously the Colts really like Fountain, but Patman was the one who made the roster. So just hats off to Patman, and hopefully he can get on the field and make some plays this year.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Zach, so much for coming on. Colts football, like I mentioned at the beginning, 6 days away. We are so excited. I cannot wait for football. It's coming very, very soon. man, it's just so exciting that football is here. I mean, I keep saying it, but I'm just so giddy. It's here. It's here. So I appreciate it, Zach, for coming on. Thank you guys for listening. And as always, go Colts.